spotlight is James Stoddard, and we are so pleased to have him to come speak to us today. I'm excited about reading his books. I've heard so many good things about them, and I haven't been reading anything. I've been being lazy. So anyway, I'm so excited. James, will you come tell us about your writing journey?
Okay. I'm not sure why I was so fascinated with fantasy growing up. I think it was maybe the era that I grew up in. The Twilight Zone had just come out. Star Trek, the original Star Trek came out. We landed a man on the moon. I think all of those things contributed. But I started writing when I was about 14 years old in study hall for something to do. And I was writing science fiction because I was reading it at that time, particularly Ray Bradbury, but some other writers as well. And so I was trying to write science fiction until I read The Lord of the Rings. And Gene Wolfe, the author, talks about the Golden Book. And the Golden Book is that book that you read that changes your life or affects your life. And we've all got one. Some book that you read at some time that you carry with you for the rest of your life. Maybe you read it 5 or 6 times. I read The Lord of the Rings at least that many, I think. And I hope to read it a couple more times while I'm on the planet. Now, when The Lord of the Rings came out, and I knew that kind of thing was what I wanted to write, but fantasy was not a genre. It did not exist. Science fiction was a genre, and some fantasy was published under that, but it was not a genre. And so Valentine Books started trying to find fantasy to publish, and there wasn't any. And so they began to look at older works. And from about 1969 to 1973, they published a series of fantasy novels that went back to the late 1800s. People who you may not have heard of, you may have heard of William Morris because he invented wallpaper and chairs and a whole bunch of stuff as well. Not actually invented it, but he came up with styles of it. George MacDonald, Lord Dunsany, who was a English or Scottish baron. Anyway, these were a lot of them very stylistic writers. And so those were my influences, and one of the things that I came away from that was that every fantasy novel should be different. And now we look at the thousands of fantasy novels that are out there, and it's become a genre, and so we have all the different categories. But that wasn't really my concept of fantasy from what I'd seen, and those were my influences. And in college, while I was getting my business degree, I wrote a fantasy novel. It's still in a box somewhere in my house, and will remain there for the rest of its life. But after college, I wrote a short story, and in those days, writing short stories was how you got into the science fiction fantasy world. And so the story I wrote was called The Perfect Day. I sent it to an editor by the name of George Sithers. He sent it back and said, I like the concept, I don't like the ending, fix it and send it back to me. So I sent it back to him. I made changes, I sent it back. He sent it back to me, and he said, you've almost got it, but this is a little too philosophical, we need some kind of action, rewrite it and send it back to me. So you don't get that anymore. You just don't get it. And I'm very grateful to him for the time that he spent. Anyway, so I sent it, he actually changed companies. He went to Amazing Stories magazine, so I lost track of him for a short period of time. Then he appeared, and so I sent it to him, and he published it. Now at that time, Amazing Stories was kind of a big deal because Steven Spielberg had licensed that name for a series of television shows that he did. So it was kind of a neat thing. Now, I'm a master at marketing, and so after publishing that short story, I immediately quit writing for a number of years. And that was because I've always had a passion for music and for writing, and it's been both a blessing and a curse. And so at that point, I was trying to do songwriting. I had been out to California where I nearly starved to death, trying to get into the music business. And I came back home. South Plains College had just started a program on how to record, be a sound recording engineer. Started taking classes there, created a home studio, and I was sending songs out to publishers to try to get songs published at that point. That was the absolute wrong way to do that. In those days, if you wanted to be in the music business, you really needed to move to Los Angeles or Nashville. And so I compiled a lot of rejection letters from that. But it ended up with my getting a job at South Plains College teaching sound technology, which turned out to be a really great career. Now, in the 1990s, while I was teaching, I wrote a novel called The Old Armorer War. And then I also started work on the novel The High House, which would be published. So that year, coincidentally, Writer's Digest came out with a big, thick book that was Writer's Market for Science Fiction and Fantasy. And so it had lists of all the agents that were interested in science fiction and fantasy. They never published it again, as far as I know. It was a one-shot deal. Probably wasn't terribly successful because it was kind of expensive. Anyway, I bought the book. I sent 25 form letters. It would have the agent's name and address on the top, as we used to do. And but basically, the letter was a form letter talking about my book, and I sent 25 out for the Old Armorer War. I received 2 responses from agents, and I ended up communicating with one of those agents, who was Donald Moss, who was the Donald Moss agency in New York. I sent him the manuscript to the Old Armorer War, and in the letter I mentioned that I was writing The High House and what the concept was for it. And so he wasn't interested in the Old Armorer War, but he says, I want to see The High House when you get done with it. And so I finished it. I sent it to him. He liked it. We signed contracts. He came up with a marketing plan. And back in those days, an agent only sent a manuscript to one editor at a time. And so there was a certain amount of time that had to pass. Now you get an agent, you think, oh, I've got it named down. You know, the agent is going to sell this book and all will be well. And the first 2 agents turned it down. One of them said that this is a beautiful book, beautifully written book that has absolutely no soul. Now, just as a quick aside, I later met her. I always sent thank you letters to editors when they turned me down, and I thought that was a common practice. I met her at a convention, and she said, "Are you James Stoddard?" I said, "Yes." She says, "Thank you so much for that letter. That meant a tremendous amount to me." That was a lesson that I thought was kind of important, that these editors don't get that kind of feedback sometimes. Anyway, so let me find myself here. The third editor, Betsy Mitchell at Warner Books, wanted the book. When Don called me and said, congratulations, we've got a contract. Now, I had mentioned to him that he had asked me, what do you want to write next? And at that time, I thought, well, I hadn't planned on it, but I think I could write a sequel to this book. And so when he called me, he said, congratulations, we've got a deal. It's a 2-book deal. And so you're going to write the sequel. And so that was the first time I ever had to write a book to time. You have this much time to write a book. And that was more stressful than I would like. Anyway, both of the books were published. The High House came out in paperback. It was picked up by the Science Fiction Book Club, so there is a hardback edition of that. Anyway, yeah, it's beautifully done covers, I thought. The book won the Compton Crook Award, which was given by the Baltimore Science Fiction Convention. It was listed on the Barnes & Noble Best Fantasy Novels. It was nominated for 5 or 6 awards. The one I really would have liked to have won was the Mythopoeic Award, which I think I came in second on that. Some no-name writer by the name of Neil Gaiman won that thing for Stardust, which later became a movie. I really wanted that award because they gave you a statue of Aslan from the Narnia books. So that was disappointing. Anyway, so things were going great guns. There was a producer in New York that wanted to option the book, and so he optioned it for a movie. He tried to make a movie for about 6 or 7 years, and of course I got a little option money during that period of time. The first script that he sent me was awful. I wondered why they had optioned the book. It wasn't anything close to the story. But we kind of worked together, not in me doing any writing, but just me saying, this is kind of what the idea behind the book was. The scripts continued. It eventually ended up in what was called the Warner's Co-op, which was a group of writers working for Warner Brothers. And the guy that, I don't know his name, the guy that wrote the script for the movie Rain Man, did a script for it that I had never seen and I would like to see. But apparently they couldn't get enough backing, and so that deal fell through. But, I made a little money on it, and I got to tell people that story. And so that was kind of fun. Now, when I was going through all this, I was in what I call the machine, being in the machine. And let me tell you, being in the machine can be a lot of fun. You've got your editors telling you how much she loves the book. Your agent says you're going to be enormously successful. Fans are writing you letters and saying, it's the most wonderful book in the world. I had a tentative agreement with the editor to write a third book in the series. I was working on that, and I did a lot of my writing in the summer. I mean, I wrote while I was teaching, but in the summer I would have several hours in the mornings to teach. I mean, to write. And so I was doing that. It was August, toward the end of the summer. It was my birthday, and I got an email from my agent that said, "Well, the editor contacted me, and whenever you books are sold to bookstores, they can be returned. And so, and basically when they do that, I assume they still do it this way, they tear off the covers of the paperback, and then they send the covers in to the publisher, and the publisher reimburses them for the book. And they said, well, we've looked at our returns, and the book hasn't sold quite as well as we thought, and so we need you to write something else. Now, even my agent was surprised. We sold several thousand copies of the book. He said, we made money, and the publisher made money on this book. He says, I don't really understand this. But when you're in the machine, you have to sell a lot of copies. And there's the bottom line on that. And it did not sell enough copies. And so I was supposed to write something else. Well, maybe the big lesson here is that you should have something else if you're gonna play with the big publishers. And I did not. I came up with a proposal. The editor didn't like it. I decided I didn't do well with proposals, that I needed to at least write the first draft of a book. And so I got an idea for writing an undersea fantasy novel, people living under the ocean, and I tried to make it as realistic as possible. I did a lot of research on the ocean, on the various kinds of fish, and what you would see in the ocean. Anyway, so I wrote it was supposed to be a trilogy. I wrote the first volume, one draft of it, then I went in and polished the first 50 pages, sent it to my agent. I met with him at a convention in Montreal, and now this was in 2002, and my agent lived in Manhattan, and 9/11 was in 2001, and so mostly during that lunch, we talked about 9/11, because he was still in shock. Looking back, I kind of realize that now, that he was still in shock. And so he had also just sold a book for well over 6 figures, I think. And so he was looking for big books. And so for whatever reason, he didn't care for the undersea novel. I actually think it could have been a really good book. I never finished that draft. I did sell the first chapter later, like in the last 3 or 4 years, as a short story. And I may come back to that if I ever get the time to do it. But that was pretty much, I didn't know it at the time, but that was pretty much the end of my dealings with the big publishing houses. I wrote some other things. At that point, my agent had become a gatekeeper, which should be a sign that you get another agent, but I was naive about that. I tend to be loyal to people. And so I stayed with him far longer than I should have. Anyway, it took me a long time to get to the point where I wanted to self-publish. Growing up, the whole goal was that you write something, you send it to an editor, the editor likes it, the editor publishes it, and anything other than that was just considered a vanity press back in those days. And so it took me a number of years before I finally got to the point where I said, okay, this self-publishing thing seems to be what people do. And so, but going back a little bit, when the High House first came out, Gordon Van Gelder, who was an editor is an editor at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, came up to me at a convention, and he said, I really like your book. He says, do you ever write short stories? And I said, well, I really don't. And he wandered off. We had a nice conversation. He wandered off, and I slapped myself on the forehead and thought, an editor just asked me for a short story, and I said, no. Again, my marketing genius came out. But I ended up, I thought I need to write a short story and send it to him. And so I wrote a short story based around the High House novel, sent it to him. And that ended up with him publishing 5 or 6 of my short stories. 2 of them were placed in Year's Best anthologies. Anyway, that was a tremendous boost to be able to continue to put your name out there and to work with a professional editor. Anyway, since that time, we've self-published. I've had KJ helping me with my promotional stuff in the last year. We came up with, mostly KJ, came up with a cover for the 25th anniversary edition of the High House. I was online one day and I discovered that my book is being called a cult classic. So, anyway, I thought she did beautiful work on the cover, and she's been helping me out. I'll end with one little thing. Years ago when the High House came out, I got a letter, email from a young lady, probably 19, 20 years old, who was from France. Now, the High House was not published in French. It was published in German, Russian, Czechoslovakian, and in Spain. I always enjoyed my Czech. But she had read it in English, and she emailed me and she said, would it be okay if I translated your book into French so that my mother could read it? Which I thought was very touching at the time. I wrote her back and said, sure, yeah, knowing that no kid was going to actually spend the time to translate the entire book. But so I got a letter from her last year, and she was surprised that I remembered her. And anyway, she just wrote me and said, your book has meant a lot to me over the years. Anyway, so we've corresponded a couple of times, and it's been very touching to me, to get those kind of emails. And one thing that I always did, whenever fans wrote me, I always wrote them back. And this has resulted in me having friendships. There's one doctor in Maine that I've actually been to his house. We corresponded for years. Two of the people that wrote me back then have since become editors. On my newsletter that KJ's been helping me do, I actually do a separate newsletter for these people. I call them the Reader Elite. And because some of them, we've had quite a bit of correspondence. And so anyway, that to me, that was one of the smartest marketing things I did. And it wasn't marketing, it was just that I thought that I owed them a letter back. So anyway, that's what I've been doing over the last years. So.